Imagine you are in a warm kitchen during the cold winter months. You smell something sweet and spicy in the air. This wonderful smell comes from a small brown seed that you can grate into your hot milk or sweet cakes. It feels hard and rough in your hand, but it creates a magic dust that makes everything taste better. Today, we call this spice nutmeg. It is very easy to find at the local grocery store for just a few dollars. However, many years ago, this tiny seed was one of the most valuable items on the entire planet. A long time ago, the special nutmeg tree grew only on a small group of islands called the Banda Islands. These tiny islands are in the country we now call Indonesia. For many centuries, local people collected the seeds from the fruit of these trees. They knew that the seeds had a very strong smell and a wonderful taste. Because these trees did not grow anywhere else in the world, the small seeds were very rare and special. People used them for medicine and to make their food taste much better during long winters. It was a secret treasure hidden away in the middle of a deep blue ocean. During the long years of the Middle Ages, the people of Europe lived in a world without many comforts. Life was often difficult, and the food was usually very simple and boring. Most people ate bread, soup, and dried meat every day. They wanted something to make their lives feel more exciting and special. This is why the arrival of new spices from far away was such a big event for everyone. Among all these wonderful things, the small seed of the nutmeg tree was one of the most mysterious and expensive items a person could ever hope to own in their entire life. These valuable seeds did not just appear in the markets of Europe by magic. Instead, they traveled across many thousands of miles with the help of brave Arab traders. These men were experts at navigating the wide, deep oceans and the hot, dry deserts of the East. They bought the nutmeg from local farmers in distant lands and began a very long journey toward the West. These traders were very smart because they knew that the people in Europe would pay a lot of money for a tiny piece of this brown spice that smelled like a dream from another world. To reach the busy markets, the traders had to cross dangerous waters in small wooden boats. They watched the stars in the night sky to find their way across the sea. After the sea journey, they moved the heavy bags of spices onto the backs of many camels. These large animals walked in long lines called caravans across the burning sands of the desert. It took many months of hard work and many long nights under the stars to reach the cities of Europe. Every step of the way, the traders had to protect their precious bags from thieves. One of the most interesting things about the spice trade was the big secret. The Arab traders never told the people in Europe where the nutmeg actually grew. They wanted to keep their business safe, so they made up many strange and scary stories. They told the Europeans that the nutmeg grew in dangerous places, guarded by giant birds or monsters that lived in the dark forests. Because of these stories, the people in Europe believed that the spice was a gift from a magical place. This mystery made the nutmeg even more special and increased its price in the markets. In those times, nutmeg was not just used for cooking delicious food. Many people believed that the spice had powerful magic that could stop terrible sicknesses. During the Middle Ages, many people became very ill from a disease called the Black Death. Doctors thought that carrying a small piece of nutmeg around the neck could protect a person from the invisible germs in the air. People would even pay their entire life savings to buy one single seed if they thought it would keep their family healthy. Because of this belief, the demand for nutmeg grew very high. To own a small bag of nutmeg was a sign of incredible wealth and power. If a king or a queen wanted to show their guests how rich they were, they would bring out a silver grater. They would slowly grate a tiny bit of nutmeg onto their meat or their wine in front of everyone. This was a way of telling the world that they had enough money to buy things from the other side of the planet. For most regular people, seeing a nutmeg seed was a rare event that they would remember for the rest of their lives. Even though it was very expensive, the rich people of Europe loved the way nutmeg changed the taste of their meals. During the winter, the meat was often old and did not taste very good. The strong, sweet smell of the nutmeg could hide the bad taste of the food and make it taste fresh again. Chefs in the great castles would use just a tiny pinch of the spice to create fancy dishes for important parties. They believed that the smell of the nutmeg was the smell of paradise. This deep love for the spice created a huge market. The Arab traders were very successful because they were the only people who knew the secret paths to the islands. They controlled the prices and decided who could buy the seeds in the big markets of Alexandria or Venice. For a long time, the rich merchants in the city of Venice became very wealthy by selling the nutmeg to other parts of Europe. They worked closely with the Arab traders to make sure that no one else could find the source. This system worked perfectly for a long time, and the price of one single nutmeg seed remained very high. As the years went by, the desire for nutmeg only grew stronger in the hearts of the Europeans. They were tired of paying so much money to the middlemen and the traders, who kept all the secrets. Sailors and explorers began to dream of finding their own way to the islands where the trees grew. They studied old maps and looked at the ocean with a new sense of curiosity and hope. The Middle Ages were coming to an end, and a new era was about to begin. Soon, the secret of the Arab traders would be discovered. In the year 1511, the world began to change for everyone. For a long time, people in Europe only bought spices from traders who traveled across the dry deserts. Nobody knew exactly where the nutmeg trees grew. The Portuguese king wanted to find the secret path to these special islands. He sent his best sailors across the deep blue oceans to look for the place where the air smelled like sweet spices. These brave men traveled for many months on large wooden ships. They faced many storms and big waves because they wanted to find the famous Banda Islands and become very wealthy and powerful men. The Portuguese explorers were very skilled at sailing their ships through dangerous waters. They used the stars and special tools to find their way across the sea. After a very long journey, they finally reached a busy city called Malacca. This city was a very important place for trading many different things from all over the world. The Portuguese leader decided that they must control this city first. By taking control of Malacca, they could find the secret maps that showed the way to the tiny islands where the nutmeg grew. It was a very exciting and dangerous time for all the brave sailors who wanted to find the gold. Once they had the maps, 3 ships sailed further east into the unknown parts of the ocean. The sailors were tired, but they were very hopeful about what they might find. One day, they saw green land rising from the blue water. They had finally reached the Banda Islands in the year 1511. The islands were small and very beautiful, with tall trees and rich soil. The local people were surprised to see these strange men from a faraway land. These islands were the only place on the whole earth where the precious nutmeg tree grew naturally in the middle of the deep green forest. The Portuguese sailors walked onto the sandy beaches and saw the wonderful fruit for themselves. The nutmeg fruit looked like a small yellow peach. When the fruit opened, it showed a dark seed covered in a bright red skin. This red skin is called mace, which is another very expensive spice. The sailors were amazed because they realized they had found a mountain of gold. They quickly began to talk with the local leaders to buy as much nutmeg as their ships could carry. They offered things like metal tools and colorful cloth in exchange for the small brown seeds that were so valuable to the rich people in Europe. For several years, the Portuguese were the only people from Europe who knew how to reach these secret islands. They returned to their home country with ships full of spices. When they sold the nutmeg in the markets of Europe, they made a huge amount of money. One bag of nutmeg could pay for a whole house or a large farm. The King of Portugal became very wealthy because of this secret trade. He told his sailors to keep the location of the islands a secret. He did not want other kings to send their own ships to take the spices from him and his very successful people. However, a secret this big is very hard to keep for a long time. Other countries in Europe soon heard stories about the rich spice islands. Sailors from Spain, England, and the Netherlands started to look for their own paths across the sea. They were jealous of the Portuguese and wanted to have a share of the great wealth. These countries began to build even bigger and faster ships. They also put many large guns on their ships because they knew they would have to fight for the seeds. The ocean was no longer a quiet place for trading, but a place for competition and many dangerous and loud battles. The Portuguese tried very hard to protect their monopoly on the nutmeg trade. They built small forts and kept soldiers on some of the islands to watch for enemies. but they did not have enough men to guard every beach and every forest. The islands were very far away from Portugal, and it took a long time for help to arrive. Sometimes, the local people were not happy with the Portuguese because they wanted to sell their spices to anyone who offered a good price. This created many problems and made it easier for other European nations to enter the area and start their own trading without any legal permission. In the late 16th century, the sailors from the Netherlands became the strongest rivals. These Dutch sailors were very good at business and had many ships. They decided that they did not want to buy nutmeg from the Portuguese anymore. Instead, they wanted to control the islands themselves. The Dutch people were very determined and spent a lot of money to send large groups of soldiers to the east. They arrived with many big guns and strong ships that were better than the Portuguese ones. This was the beginning of a very long and difficult war for control of the tiny, special spice islands in the big ocean. The Dutch people wanted to be the masters of the spice trade. They created a very big and powerful company called the Dutch East India Company. In their own language, they called it the VOC. This company was not like a normal business that we see today. It was more like a small country, because it had its own soldiers and many large ships. The leaders of this company wanted to make sure that no other country could buy or sell nutmeg. They wanted to control every single tree on the islands, so they could become the richest people in the world. They knew that the world was hungry for the special taste of this rare and expensive spice. To keep this control, the Dutch company was often very mean and cruel to the local people living on the Banda Islands. They told the local leaders that they could only sell their special nutmeg to the Dutch. If the local people tried to sell the seeds to traders from other countries, the Dutch soldiers would punish them very harshly. This was a very sad time for the people of the islands, because their beautiful home became a place of war and fear. The Dutch built big stone forts with many guns to watch the ocean and keep other ships away from their valuable spice. These soldiers patrolled the beaches day and night to protect the trees. While the Dutch were trying to take over everything, the British also arrived to find the spice. The British sailors were brave, and they managed to find a very small island called Run. This island was one of the few places where nutmeg trees grew naturally in the forest. The local people on the island of Run liked the British more than the Dutch because the British promised to protect them. For many years, the British and the Dutch fought small battles over this tiny piece of land. Both countries knew that owning this island meant they could control a large part of the world's wealth. It was a very dangerous game of power on the high seas. The fighting between these two European powers lasted for a very long time. It was a difficult period because the islands were very far away from Europe. News traveled slowly on wooden ships across the vast blue oceans. During this time, the Dutch company became even more powerful and aggressive. They destroyed many nutmeg trees on other islands so that the spice would stay rare and expensive. By making the spice harder to find, they could charge more money in the markets of London and Amsterdam. They were willing to do anything to keep their secret monopoly safe from their many enemies and rivals from other lands. In the year 1667, the leaders of the Dutch and the British finally decided to talk about peace. They were tired of the long wars and the high cost of fighting at sea. They met in a city called Breda to sign a very famous paper. This deal would change the map of the world forever. At that time, the British held the tiny island of Run, which the Dutch really wanted. The Dutch already had a colony in North America called New Amsterdam. Today, we know this place as Manhattan, which is a very famous part of New York City. This city was very small back then. The two countries made a trade that seems very strange to us today. The British agreed to give the tiny island of Run to the Dutch company. In exchange, the Dutch gave the British the island of Manhattan in North America. At that time, many people thought the Dutch were the winners of this deal. Nutmeg was worth more than almost anything else, and the island of Run was full of those precious trees. Manhattan was just a small town, with some farms and fur traders. The Dutch were very happy because they finally had complete control over every single nutmeg tree in the world. They thought this was a very smart trade for them. After they got the island of Run, the Dutch became even more careful with their prize. They did not want anyone to take a seed and plant it in a different country. To stop this from happening, The Dutch workers dipped every single nutmeg seed in a white liquid called lime. This process made sure that the seeds could be used for cooking or medicine, but they could never grow into new trees. This was a clever but greedy plan to keep the spice trade only for themselves. They wanted to be sure that they would remain the only source of nutmeg for many hundreds of years. They watched over every harvest with great care. The Dutch company became the richest business in the history of the world because of these small brown seeds. They sold the nutmeg in Europe for a price that was many times higher than what they paid. The money they made helped to build the beautiful canals and tall houses that we can still see in the city of Amsterdam today. However, we must remember that this wealth came with a very high price for the local people in Indonesia. Many thousands of people lost their lives or their freedom because the Dutch company valued the spice more than human lives during this very dark time in history. For a very long time, the Dutch people were the only ones who could sell nutmeg to the rest of the world. They kept the price very high because they owned every single tree on the special islands in the East Indies. However, in the year 1770, a brave man from France decided that this was not fair. His name was Pierre Poivre, and he was a person who loved plants and nature very much. He believed that the beauty of nature should belong to everyone, not just one powerful company. He began to make a secret plan to change things. Pierre Poivre was a very smart explorer and botanist who had traveled to many faraway lands during his life. He knew that if he could get just a few healthy seeds, he could grow them in other parts of the world. At that time, the Dutch were very strict and would punish anyone who tried to take the seeds away. They even put lime on the nutmeg seeds so they could not grow if someone stole them. Pierre Poivre knew that his mission would be very dangerous. If the Dutch soldiers caught him, he would be in big trouble. The Frenchman traveled many miles across the big blue ocean to reach the islands where the nutmeg grew in the wild forests. He had to be very quiet and careful as he moved through the thick green trees and mud. The smell of the spices was everywhere in the air, but the Dutch soldiers were also watching everything very closely. Pierre Poivre waited for the right moment when nobody was looking at him. He managed to collect several healthy seeds and small plants that were still full of life. He hid them carefully on his ship so no one could find them. Once he was safely away from the Dutch islands, Pierre Poivre sailed to a beautiful and sunny place called Mauritius. This island was controlled by the French government, and the weather there was perfect for tropical plants to thrive. He spent many weeks and months caring for the small nutmeg trees with great patience and love. He watched them every day to make sure they stayed healthy, strong, and green. Eventually, the trees began to grow tall and produce their own seeds. This was a huge victory for the Frenchmen because it meant that the Dutch monopoly was finally broken. When news of this success reached other countries, the British leaders also wanted to grow their own nutmeg. They did not want to pay high prices to the Dutch merchants anymore. In the years that followed, the British took seeds to their own colonies in different parts of the world. They found that the spice grew very well in a place called Singapore, which was a very busy port. They also realized that the islands in the Caribbean Sea had the right soil and heat. Specifically, the island of Grenada became a very important place for growing these trees for the British. Because the nutmeg trees were now growing in many different countries, everything began to change in the global markets forever. Craze. Before this time, only a few very rich people could afford to buy even a tiny bit of the special spice. However, with more trees growing in Mauritius, Singapore, and Grenada, there was much more nutmeg available for everyone to buy. When there is a lot of something, the price usually starts to go down very quickly. This is exactly what happened to the cost of nutmeg. It was no longer a rare treasure that was worth as much as gold. Soon, the price of nutmeg became much lower than it had been for hundreds of years. This was wonderful news for regular families who lived in Europe and many other places. They could finally go to their local markets and buy a small amount of the spice for their own kitchens at home. People started using nutmeg to flavor their meat, their bread, and their sweet desserts during dinner. The warm and spicy taste became a favorite for many people during the cold winter months. Nutmeg was slowly becoming a normal part of life for many regular families. The Dutch company was very unhappy about these changes because they were losing their power and their money. They had tried for a long time to keep the Nutmeg Islands a secret from the rest of the world. But the bravery of the Frenchmen and the efforts of the British showed that secrets are hard to keep forever. The world was becoming more connected, and plants were moving across the wide oceans to new homes. This period in history was very important because it broke the control that one single company had over such a famous, tasty, and popular spice. By the end of the 18th century, nutmeg was a global product that traveled on many different ships across the sea. The island of Grenada became so famous for its nutmeg that it eventually put a picture of the spice on its national flag. This shows how important the tree became to the people living there. Even though the journey of the seeds started on tiny islands in Indonesia, they now lived and grew all around the world. The brave actions of people like Pierre Poivre helped to share the delicious taste of nutmeg with every single person. Today, nutmeg is a common spice that we can find in almost every grocery store around the whole world. It is no longer a secret kept by traders, and it is certainly not worth more than gold anymore. The most important places for growing these special trees are still Indonesia and the island of Grenada. Farmers work hard to harvest the seeds so that we can enjoy them in our kitchens. We use this wonderful spice to make many delicious things like sweet cakes, apple pies, and warm milk drinks during the cold holiday season. Its soft smell reminds many people of home and happy times with their families. Even though nutmeg is cheap and easy to buy today, it still has a very rich and interesting history. The journey of this small seed changed the map of the world and even influenced the history of big cities like New York. When we sprinkle a little bit of the brown powder on our food, we are tasting a small piece of a very long adventure across the deep blue oceans. It is amazing to think about how much people once fought for this simple seed. We should remember its story every time we taste its unique flavor in our favorite meals. If you have listened this far, please like and subscribe to follow our next videos.